Hello. This is episode 11 of our series on life and productivity hacks. Welcome. So, at the end of the previous conversation, which was about how to interrupt people when they seemingly wouldn't stop talking, we had a couple of people, two people, who wrote in with exactly the same request, which was, can we do an episode on how not to be defensive in a conversation? So, on the one hand, you want to be able to interrupt people when they are rambling away, but equally important is how not to be defensive when you are under attack or when someone is making a counterpoint. And when I read these requests, it immediately resonated. It struck a chord because not being defensive is so central, is tremendously important to being a good communicator. So this episode we're going to be talking about what is it that we can do to first recognize that we are getting defensive or we may be getting defensive in our communication, and b, one or two things that we can consciously do to steer clear of giving signals to the other person that we may be getting defensive, and in the process, setting in to motion some kind of a verbal warfare. Right. So first things first. Getting defensive is the most natural, adaptive form of human behavior. So if you kind of zoom out and if you look at it from the perspective of evolution, uh, when we were under physical attack, you had to learn to defend yourself to be able to get out of those situations alive. And to that end, even today, our default setup genetically is to react in much the same manner when we are under an emotional or verbal attack, whether real or perceived. So to begin with, it is a perfectly normal way of reacting or responding to a situation. Now, that said, clearly there are many things that work against you, that when we are um, when we become defensive in our conversations. So here's two or three things that you want to be able to do to have a meaningful conversation when under attack. Right. So the first thing you want to be able to do is validate the other person's perception. Right. So right, wrong, somewhere in between, outlandish, what have you. When you have someone expressing a point of view which is in disagreement with what you have to say, or which is offending you in a certain manner, the first thing you want to be able to do is, in a very matter of factly way, validate that person's opinion without any judgment. That's one. Second, express agreement with parts of that perception or part of that feeling that you are in resonance with. So if you think that there are one or two elements of what is being told to you that you resonate with, that you think are true or you're in agreement with, please say or paraphrase the same thing. Third, find that little grain of criticism that you think is true in that entire spiel that you just received. So, criticism is never, as I'm sure you've seen on hundreds of occasions, criticism is never packed in the manner that is palatable, that is acceptable, where you can make sense of it or unpack it immediately. Some most often it is a long ramble. It goes into several directions, but almost always there is the smallest grain of truth, if not more, hidden somewhere inside that that spiel. So the third thing you want to do is find that little piece of truth that you think, that criticism, and say that back to the person, and say that, okay, so I think that what you're saying is something that you're able to see you need to work on. And finally, without using the word but or any variation thereof, you want to simply express the points in what was told to you that you don't agree with or you have a different point of view, right? So validate the perception, express agreement with those pieces of the conversation that you think are are broadly acceptable. Find the little grain of truth in terms of the criticism and let the other person know that you've heard that out and you think that is a point of that's an area of improvement. And fourth, having done all three of those things without using but, without counter criticizing. So, for instance, one of our one of our most natural tendencies when we face music, conversation is to give it back as good as we get. That's about the worst time to let the other person know what's wrong with them. So you want to steer clear of counter criticizing. Second, you want to be able to also ask for specifics. Like if it is not very clear as to what the other person is getting at, uh, you want to ask for examples, etc. Right. So that's one way of having a conversation without sounding defensive.